When Aissa Derhem told the Moroccan government he could harvest water from thin air, they thought he was joking. The desert was winning. Wells were running dry. Villages were emptying out. And here was a mathematician from a mountain village saying he could catch clouds with nets. The engineers had tried everything: dams, irrigation canals, deep drilled wells funded by international aid. Millions of dollars poured into the Moroccan Anti-Atlas, and the region kept dying. So when Derhem and his team showed up with mesh fabric stretched between poles, something that looked like a volleyball net left out in a field, nobody took them seriously. The government officials shook their heads. They had hydrologists, civil engineers, water management experts with decades of experience. They had built infrastructure across the country. And now someone wanted them to believe that fabric on a mountaintop could solve a crisis that had resisted every serious intervention for 30 years. The local farmers watched and waited for these outsiders to fail, just like everyone else had failed before them. The elders remembered when the land was green. They did not believe it could happen again. 14 years later, those same government officials came to see what Derhem built, the world's largest fog harvesting facility, over 1,700 square meters of nets pulling water out of the sky. 16 villages now have running water in their homes. Women who used to walk 4 hours a day hauling jerrycans now run agricultural cooperatives. Girls who dropped out of school to fetch water are graduating. But to understand how nets on a mountain saved a region, you have to understand what was killing it. The 8-Bomrane region sits in a brutal paradox. To the west, the Atlantic Ocean, cold currents, moisture-heavy winds. To the east, the edge of the Sahara Desert, hot sand, cracked earth, almost no rain. The ground gets less than 130 millimeters of rainfall a year. That's about 5 inches. For context, a healthy lawn needs 20 inches. The region is functionally classified as one step away from true desert, and for the last 3 decades, even that meager rainfall has been failing. The water table has been collapsing. Deep underground, fossil water reserves that took thousands of years to accumulate have been draining away. In 30 years, groundwater levels dropped by as much as 65 meters, a 200-foot drop. Wells that once hit water at 20 meters now drill past 80 meters if they hit water at all, and what they find is often poisoned. As freshwater pressure drops, seawater creeps inland through the rock. Wells turn brackish. Some test positive for uranium, leached from deep rock formations. Others are contaminated with agricultural runoff. In regions without proper sanitation, shallow wells become breeding grounds for disease. The human cost was measured in time. Women and girls spent 3 to 4 hours every day walking to distant wells, waiting in line, and hauling heavy containers back over rocky terrain. That's 1,400 hours a year per woman, time that couldn't be spent farming, earning income, or getting an education. Young girls were pulled out of school to help their mothers carry water. The drought wasn't just killing crops, it was killing futures. This wasn't just inconvenience, it was structural poverty built into the daily rhythm of life. A girl who spends her childhood hauling water doesn't learn to read. A woman who walks 4 hours a day can't start a business. The water crisis had become a trap that locked generation after generation into the same cycle, with no way out except leaving. Men left. They migrated to Agadir, Casablanca, even Europe, searching for work that could support the families they left behind. The villages hollowed out. What remained were women, children, and the elderly, holding on to communities that were slowly bleeding into the sand. In similar regions of Morocco, entire villages have been abandoned, ghost towns swallowed by the advancing desert. The residents of the 8-Bomrane villages could see their future in those empty buildings. The government tried to stop it. They had money. They had engineers. They had plans approved by international development agencies. They built dams. The dams silted up within years, their reservoirs filling with sediment instead of water. The concrete structures still stand in some valleys, monuments to expensive miscalculation. They funded deep wells with motorized pumps. The pumps accelerated the groundwater collapse, pulling water out faster than nature could replace it. Every new well drilled deeper, chasing a water table that kept falling until the cost of drilling exceeded what any village could afford. It was a race to the bottom, and the bottom kept moving. International aid organizations came with irrigation systems designed in offices thousands of kilometers away. The systems required maintenance, spare parts, technical expertise, none of which existed in remote mountain villages. The pumps broke. Nobody could fix them. The irrigation channels cracked and leaked. Within a few years, the expensive equipment sat rusting in the sun, useless. The solutions all shared the same flaw. They tried to fight the desert with brute force. More infrastructure, bigger machines, deeper holes. They assumed that enough money and enough concrete could overpower the problem. And the desert kept winning because the desert wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that everyone was looking at the ground. Aissa Derhem grew up in these mountains. He remembered the fog that rolled in from the ocean, thick and heavy, blanketing the peaks in gray moisture. As a mathematician, he started to see that fog differently, not as weather as a resource. A suspended reservoir drifting overhead, untapped. The physics were simple. Warm, wet air from the Atlantic hits the cold Canary Current along the coast. The temperature difference causes the moisture to condense into low-lying clouds. The trade winds push these clouds inland. The mountains force the air upward, but a temperature inversion layer traps the clouds at low altitude. The result is a river of fog, flowing through the mountain passes 143 days a year, carrying more fresh water than all the failed dams and wells combined. The fog was reliable. It showed up even in drought years, decoupled from the rain cycles that kept failing. The fog was free. It required no pumps, no fuel, no deep drilling. The only question was how to catch it. Derhem partnered with Jamila Bargach, an anthropologist who understood that any solution had to fit the community, not the other way around. Together, they founded an organization and reached out to scientists at the University of La Laguna in the Canary Islands, who had been studying fog harvesting for years. In 2006, they installed test equipment on Mount Boutmezguida, a peak standing 1,225 meters above sea level, directly in the path of the fog highway. The results were striking. Coastal sites produced less than 2 liters per square meter per day. The summit averaged over 7 liters. That was potential. The contrast with the failed approaches could not have been sharper. The dams tried to store water that was not falling. The wells tried to extract water that was running out. The irrigation systems tried to move water that did not exist. Every conventional solution fought against the physics of a drying climate. Derhem's approach worked with it. The fog was already there. The wind was already blowing. The mountain was already in the way. He just had to build the net. The first attempt, in 2011, used standard technology. Flat mesh nets stretched between poles, the same design that had worked in South America and the Canary Islands. The nets caught water. The numbers looked good. And then the wind tore them apart. The Anti-Atlas is not a gentle place. Wind gusts regularly exceed 100 kilometers per hour. The flat nets acted like sails, catching the full force of the gale. The fabric ripped, the poles bent. The team spent more time repairing the system than collecting water. The skeptics felt vindicated. The technology was not ready. The conditions were too harsh. The project seemed destined to join the long list of failed interventions. But Derhem didn't quit. He found new partners, the German Water Foundation and an industrial designer named Peter Trautwein. Together, they went back to the drawing board and they redesigned everything. The breakthrough was counterintuitive. Instead of making the nets stronger, they made them flexible. The new system, called Cloudfisher, was inspired by how willow trees survive storms. A rigid tree snaps in high wind, a willow bends. The mesh was no longer bolted directly to the frame. Instead, it was suspended using rubber expanders, essentially industrial bungee cords. When a gust hit, the expanders stretched, allowing the net to billow and absorb the force. The wind slid past instead of tearing through. The whole system flexed like a living thing, moving with the storm instead of standing rigid against it. And if a gust was strong enough to break the rubber failed first, protecting the expensive mesh and steel structure. The expanders acted as mechanical fuses, sacrificing themselves before the real damage could happen. Replacing a bungee cord costs almost nothing. Replacing a torn net costs thousands. The mesh itself was redesigned from scratch. Traditional nets used flat, two-dimensional fabric, basically agricultural shade cloth. When fog passed through, the tiny droplets would hit the flat surface, and most of them would get blown off before they could collect into anything useful. The wind that delivered the fog also stole the water. The cloudfisher used a three-dimensional woven material, a matrix of tiny filaments arranged in interlocking spirals, creating depth within the fabric itself. Fog droplets are microscopic, just a few thousandths of a millimeter wide. The three-dimensional structure gave them depth to travel through, more surfaces to collide with. As they bounced between filaments deep inside the mesh, they merged into larger drops, heavy enough to resist the wind, heavy enough to slide down the filaments into collection troughs below. The mesh was sheltered from the very wind that powered it. The material was engineered for endurance. It used UV-resistant synthetic fibers that would not break down under the intense mountain sun. It had a food-safe composition that would not contaminate the water. The designers estimated the mesh could last 10 to 20 years, and the steel frames 50 years or more. The result was a fog collector that could survive 120 kilometers per hour winds while pulling 22 liters of water per square meter on a foggy day. On good days, the system recorded yields of 66 liters per square meter. That was nearly 10 times what the original test nets had captured. What looked like a simple net was actually precision engineering hidden in plain sight. By 2018, the team had installed 31 cloudfisher units on Mount Bout Mesgida, covering roughly 1,700 square meters of collection surface, about the size of 3 football fields of mesh, stretched across the summit to intercept the fog. The waiting was hard. Fog harvesting is not like turning on a tap. The system depends on weather patterns, on wind direction, on moisture content in the air. Some days produced floods of water, other days, almost nothing. The skeptics pointed to the dry days and asked if this was really a solution or just an expensive experiment. The same voices that had dismissed the project from the beginning now criticized it for not delivering instant results. But the fog kept coming, 143 days a year on average. Not as reliable as a municipal water system, but far more reliable than the rainfall that had failed for decades. And unlike the groundwater that kept dropping, the fog was not depleting anything. It came from the ocean, an endless supply driven by temperature differences that human activity could not touch. The answer came in the pipes. 25 kilometers of pipeline now snaked down the mountain, connecting the collectors to 5 major storage tanks, then branching out to 16 villages in the valleys below. Water flows by gravity, no pumps, no electricity, no maintenance-hungry machinery. The storage tanks buffer the variation between foggy days and dry days, holding reserves that keep the taps running even when the clouds do not come. The first time water came out of a tap in a village home, it was not a celebration. It was disbelief. Women who had spent their entire lives hauling jerrycans stared at the faucet. Some cried. For generations, water had meant labor, pain, hours of walking. Now it flowed from a wall. The impossible had become ordinary. The system now delivers around 18 liters per person per day to roughly 1,600 people, more than double what they had before. And it arrives at their homes, not at a well 4 hours away. The water is clean. Fog water is essentially distilled by the same process that creates the clouds. No heavy metals, no salt, no contamination. It meets drinking water standards without treatment. The government officials who dismissed the project started making visits. They walked the pipeline, watched the fog roll in, saw water flowing into homes that had never had plumbing. Researchers came from international universities. Papers were published, awards given. The same officials who refused to fund it were now asking how to replicate it. Here is what the skeptics said. And here is what actually happened. They said the land was beyond saving. Today, the collectors pull 37,000 liters from the air on a typical foggy day. Peak yield was 66 liters per square meter. That is 10 times what the original test equipment measured. They said you would need dams, pumping stations, and treatment plants. The fog system runs on gravity, no fuel, no electricity, and no moving parts to break. They said groundwater was the only option. The fog system produces the most water during droughts, when aquifers are lowest and the fog is thickest. The resource appears exactly when it is needed most. Three statistics tell the story of transformation. Before the project, women spent 1,400 hours per year hauling water. Now that time goes to argan oil cooperatives that generate income, keeping people in the village. Before the project, girls dropped out of school to fetch water. Now, there is a water school teaching the physics of fog and the engineering behind the nets. Before the project, men fled to the cities. Now they are coming back. The water made small-scale farming possible again. The community donated degraded land for a training farm. Fog water grows tomatoes, onions, and herbs. Endemic species are returning, argan trees and dragon trees. As they mature, their leaves will condense moisture from the air, continuing the cycle without human help. By 2025, another 1,088 square meters of nets go up on neighboring peaks. 6 more villages connect to the grid. The German company behind Cloudfisher is deploying the technology in Tanzania and Bolivia. What started as a dismissed experiment is now a blueprint for climate adaptation worldwide. Sometimes the experts are wrong. Sometimes the simple answer is the right one. The government spent millions trying to pump water out of a dying aquifer. A mathematician in a few rolls of mesh pulled it out of the sky. Engineers said the conditions were too harsh for the technology to survive. A redesign inspired by willow trees proved them wrong. The lesson is not that experts are useless. It is that expertise can become a trap when it stops looking for new answers. The fog was always there. It took someone willing to ask a different question to see it as a resource instead of a weather pattern. Today, 16 villages have running water because a team refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. Tomorrow, that number will grow. The fog keeps coming 143 days a year, carrying fresh water from the ocean to the mountains. All we had to do was learn how to catch it. If you want to see more stories about underdogs who changed the world, hit subscribe.